There is a moment, you will know it when it comes, because your whole body will know it before your mind does. When a person who has fed on you for years looks into your eyes and, for the first time, finds nothing looking back, no fear, no apology, no scramble to please, just silence. And in that silence, something in them begins to die, not their body. Something older than their body, the mask. And what crawls out from underneath it is not a monster you should run from. It is a wound so old, so unhealed, that it never learned another way to survive, except by feeding on the light of someone else. Tonight, I do not want to talk to you about villains. I want to talk to you about what happens to a soul when it has built its entire house on someone else's foundation, and that someone finally walks away. I do not begin with theory tonight, though theory will come. I begin with an image because the psyche does not think in arguments. It thinks in images, and this one has haunted every consulting room, every marriage, every friendship where one person gave and one person only ever took. The image is this: a man stands before a mirror his whole life, and he has convinced himself that the mirror is a window. He believes he is looking out at the world, admired, understood, loved, when in fact he is only looking at his own reflection, dressed up as another person. For years the mirror obliges him. It reflects back exactly what he needs: his brilliance, his charm, his wounded innocence, his righteousness. And then one day the mirror develops a will of its own. It stops reflecting. It becomes at last a window, a person, with her own face, her own hunger, her own right to look away. And the man who built his entire identity on being seen a certain way suddenly discovers he does not know who he is when no one is watching him the way he demands to be watched. This is not a story about cruelty defeating kindness. It is a story about what the human soul does when it loses the only mirror it ever trusted to lie to it kindly. And I promise you, by the time we are finished tonight, you will never look at either the narcissist or the empath the same way again, because you will understand that both of them are playing out an ancient drama of the psyche, and only one of them has the power to end it. I have spent a great deal of my life sitting with people in the deepest kind of trouble, not the trouble of poverty or illness, though I have seen plenty of that too, but the trouble of a soul that does not know itself. And again, across every culture, every century, every union the human tongue has ever spoken, I have found the same architecture repeating itself. Every person wears a mask to meet the world. I called this mask the persona, borrowing the word the actors of the old world used for the faces they held up before the crowd. The persona is not a lie, not exactly. It is a necessary compromise between who we are and what the world will tolerate. We all wear one. The teacher wears the mask of patience even on the day her heart is breaking. The soldier wears the mask of courage even as his hands shake beneath his sleeves. This is not pathology. This is civilization. But there is a difference, and it is the difference this whole evening will turn on. There is a difference between a person who wears a mask and a person who has forgotten they are wearing one at all. The narcissist, as we have come to call this shape of suffering, is a person who has fused so completely with the mask that there is nothing left standing behind it. And I want to be very careful here because it is easy and satisfying to turn this into a story of monsters and victims. It is not that simple, and if you leave here tonight only with a villain to hate, you will have missed the entire medicine this understanding is meant to offer you. Beneath every grandiose mask I have ever encountered, without a single exception, I have found not strength but a wound of almost unbearable fragility. The mask is built precisely because what lies beneath it could not survive exposure. Somewhere, often so early that no memory remains, only a pattern, this person learned that to be loved for who they actually were was too dangerous a gamble. Perhaps they were adored only for their achievements and ignored in their ordinary humanity. Perhaps they were the family's golden vessel, forced to carry a parent's own unlived greatness. Perhaps they were shamed so deeply for their needs that needing anything at all became a kind of death. Whatever the origin, the result is the same. A self was never permitted to fully form. In its place, a performance took root, and the performance became so total, so seamless, that even the performer forgot it was one. This is what I mean when I speak of the shadow. Everything a person cannot bear to know about themselves does not simply vanish. It does not evaporate because it is denied. It goes underground. It becomes unconscious, and from the unconscious, it does not lose its power. It gains a strange and terrible autonomy. The shadow of the narcissist is enormous because the persona built to conceal it is enormous. Every ordinary human frailty, envy, fear, smallness, longing, shame, the simple ache of being an imperfect creature among other imperfect creatures, has been exiled into that shadow and disowned. And here is the mechanism you must understand if you are ever to make sense of what you have lived through. What cannot be owned must be projected. The shadow does not stay quietly in its cellar. It rises up and it looks for a screen onto which it can be thrown, so that the person carrying it can go on believing it belongs to someone else. And this is where you come in. This is where the empath enters the drama. Though I confess I dislike that word somewhat, because it suggests a fixed identity, a permanent role, when in truth it describes a capacity that any of us might develop and any of us might outgrow. What I mean by the empath tonight is the person whose own boundaries between self and other have remained porous, often because they too were shaped in childhood to believe that their worth lay in their usefulness to others, that love was a thing to be earned through the anticipation of another's needs, that their own feelings were a burden best minimized so the household could remain calm. Do you see it? Two wounds from two different directions, arriving at the same meeting point. One person who learned that being truly known was too dangerous, and built a magnificent mask instead. Another person who learned that having needs of their own was too dangerous and built an extraordinary capacity to sense and soothe the needs of others instead. When these two wounds meet, something clicks into place with the terrible seductive rightness of a key finding its lock. The narcissist finds in the empath the perfect screen. Here is a person who will absorb the projected shadow without complaint. Here is a person who will take the blame that is not hers, who will apologize for wounds she did not inflict, who will interpret cruelty as a cry for help and answer it with more devotion rather than less. Here is a person whose porous boundaries mean that the narcissist's inner emptiness can, for a while, be filled not with genuine connection, which the narcissist's fragile structure cannot risk, but with something the psychoanalytic tradition has come to call narcissistic's supply. Admiration, attention, devotion, the endless reflection of a self the narcissist cannot generate from within. And the empath, for her part, finds in the narcissist someone who desperately needs her, and to be needed when you were taught that your value lies in usefulness feels almost indistinguishable from being loved. This is the trap, not stupidity, not weakness, a trap built from two childhood educations that fit together like broken pieces of the same shattered vessel. For a long time, this arrangement holds. It holds because both parties are, in their own way, getting exactly what their wounded structure was built to seek. The narcissist receives endless mirroring. The empath receives the illusion of being essential, of being the one strong enough, loving enough, patient enough to finally be the exception, to finally be enough to make this person whole. And here I must say something that will sound harsh, though I intend it as the deepest compassion. The empath in this arrangement is not merely a victim. She is also, without knowing it, chasing her own old wound. She is trying to become, at last, so good, so loving, so endlessly understanding that she will finally be safe from abandonment. She is trying to earn, through her devotion to this fragile and demanding other, the unconditional love she perhaps never fully received. This does not make what is done to her acceptable. It makes it comprehensible. And comprehension, not blame, is the beginning of freedom. Now, let us come to the heart of what you gathered here tonight to understand. What happens, what actually happens, in the architecture of the psyche when the mirror stops playing along. I want you to picture the narcissistic structure as a great cathedral built on sand, magnificent from the outside, soaring, ornate, dazzling to behold, and utterly without foundation, because the foundation, a stable, integrated sense of self, capable of tolerating its own imperfection, was never permitted to form. The cathedral stands only because it is constantly, unconsciously, being propped up from the outside. Every piece of admiration is a beam wedged beneath a crumbling wall. Every act of devotion from the empath is another buttress holding up an edifice that cannot hold its own weight. The narcissist does not experience the empath's care as kindness offered. He experiences it on the deepest unconscious level as structural necessity. This is why the withdrawal of that care does not register to him as ordinary loss. It registers as collapse. And so, when the empath finally stops, when years of therapy or exhaustion or one final act of cruelty too large to explain away finally teach her that her devotion has been building a monument to someone else's avoidance rather than a marriage of two souls, when she stops absorbing the projections, stops apologizing for sins she did not commit, stops anticipating his moods and managing his rage and translating his cruelty into more palatable language even inside her own mind. When she simply stands there, quiet, boundaried, no longer reaching for the old rope, the cathedral does not merely lose a visitor, it loses a load-bearing wall. And what follows is not a single event. It is a sequence. And I want to walk you through each stage of it because understanding this sequence is one of the great acts of self-protection available to anyone who has ever loved one of these fractured, fascinating, dangerous souls. The first stage is disbelief dressed as entitlement. This is crucial to understand because it will not look like grief. It will look like fury. But underneath the fury, if you listen closely, you will hear something closer to genuine bewilderment. The narcissist has never truly believed the empath to be a separate person with her own sovereign will. He has experienced her unconsciously as an extension of himself, a function, a mirror that exists to perform the single task of reflecting him. When the mirror develops independent behavior, the initial response is not, I have lost someone I love. It is closer to, how is my hand refusing to do what I tell it? This is why the first wave of reaction is so often astonishing in its audacity, a demand, not a request, that things return to how they were. A flood of charm deployed like an emergency measure, the old techniques reapplied with fresh intensity, because surely, surely they will work again the way they always have. When charm fails, and this is the second stage, something colder and more calculating often emerges. This is the stage where you will hear people describe a partner or a parent or a friend suddenly capable of a kind of manipulation, so precise it seems almost professional. This is not because a new capacity has been discovered. It is because the emergency has escalated and the psyche, faced with the threat of total collapse, will reach for any tool that has ever worked. Guilt, the rewriting of history, the recruitment of allies, friends, family members, sometimes even the empath's own children, enlisted, consciously or not, into a campaign to restore the old arrangement. I have watched grown adults in this stage become almost unrecognizable to themselves, capable of cruelties they would have sworn in a calmer season they were incapable of. This is the shadow, finally fully unleashed, no longer merely projected onto the empath, but acted out directly because the screen onto which it used to be safely thrown has at last refused to catch it. And if this too fails, If the empath, however shaken, however exhausted, holds her boundary, we arrive at the third stage, and this is the one that teaches us the most about the true architecture of narcissism. This is the stage of devaluation and discard, or in cases where the structure is even more fragile, a kind of psychic collapse that can look from the outside remarkably like grief, even like the beginnings of insight. I want to be honest with you about both possibilities because I do not believe in tidy endings, and neither did the psyche ever design human suffering to resolve tidily. In the devaluation, what you will witness is the narcissist's desperate attempt to preserve the only thing his fragile structure can tolerate, the belief that he was never truly dependent at all. If he cannot have the mirror, he must destroy the value of what he has lost, so that its loss no longer threatens him. This is why you will so often hear, in the aftermath of these ruptures, a sudden and vicious rewriting of the relationship's entire history. The very qualities once prized above all else, the empath's warmth, her sensitivity, her endless capacity for care, recast overnight as weakness, as excess, as the reason the relationship failed in the first place. This is not really about her. It has never really been about her. It is the oldest defense the wounded ego knows. If I cannot keep it, I must convince myself I never wanted it. But there is another path, rarer, and I do not want to leave it out, because I have witnessed it, and it deserves to be spoken of honestly. In some structures, not most, but some, the loss of the mirror, sustained long enough, without rescue, without the empath's old reflex to return and repair, produces something closer to breakdown than escalation. The cathedral, finding no beam to prop it up, does not merely rage, it begins in places to genuinely crack. And in the cracks, something can occasionally get through that could never get through before. The raw, unmirrored, unbearable experience of the self as it actually is, without performance, without audience. This is, psychologically speaking, the only doorway through which real change has ever entered a narcissistic structure, not through punishment, not through the empath's continued sacrifice, but through the unbearable, undefended encounter with one's own emptiness, held long enough that something new might, however rarely, begin to grow in its place. I tell you this not so that you will wait for it. I tell you this so that you will understand. This transformation, if it comes at all, was never yours to produce. It was never something you could love into being by staying longer, giving more, absorbing one more wound. It either happens in the solitude the narcissist is finally forced to face, or it does not happen at all. Your presence was never the cure. Your absence, strangely, is the only thing that was ever capable of creating the conditions for one. There is one more piece of this architecture I have not yet named, and I think it is in some ways the most important piece of all, because it explains why this arrangement can persist for so many years without either party fully recognizing what is happening to them. I am speaking of what I have called the compensatory function of the unconscious. The psyche, whatever else it is a self-regulating system, always striving, in its own strange and often painful way, toward balance. When the conscious personality becomes too one-sided, too grandiose, too armored, too convinced of its own perfection, the unconscious does not simply sit by and watch. It generates dreams, moods, symptoms, even entire relationships, designed to compensate for what has been left out. This is why the narcissist, however loudly he proclaims his self-sufficiency, is so often unconsciously drawn to precisely the kind of person who carries in abundance everything he has exiled in himself: warmth, humility, the capacity to admit fault, the willingness to feel pain openly rather than deny it exists. He does not choose the empath by accident. Some deep, unspoken intelligence in him recognizes that she carries what he lost, and he is drawn to her the way a starving man is drawn to bread, even if he can never admit, even to himself, that he is starving. And the empath, in turn, is very often unconsciously compensating for something as well. So many of the empaths I have sat with across the years were raised in households where a parent's fragile ego required careful management from a very early age. A mother whose moods dictated the emotional temperature of the whole home. A father whose approval had to be earned through vigilant attentiveness rather than simply received as a birthright of being his child. These children learn, long before they have words for it, an entire unconscious curriculum: that love is conditional, that safety depends on managing another person's inner weather, that their own needs are, at best, a secondary concern to be addressed only once the more important person's needs have been satisfied. When such a child grows into an adult and meets a narcissistic partner, there is often, beneath the surface, an unconscious and heartbreakingly hopeful logic at work. Perhaps this time, if I am patient enough, loving enough, if I finally get the formula exactly right, I will succeed where I could not succeed as a child. I will make this fragile, demanding person whole, and in doing so, I will finally prove that I was worthy of love all along. This is not foolishness. This is the oldest and most human of all hopes. The hope that we might return to the scene of our original wound and, this time, rewrite its ending. I tell you this not to add another layer of blame to a story already heavy with it, but because I believe understanding is the beginning of freedom, and no freedom is possible while the deeper pattern remains invisible. You were not simply unlucky. You were not simply too kind for your own good, though you were certainly generous beyond what was ever returned to you. You were, in the oldest and most literal sense, enacting a story that began long before you ever met him, a story written in the earliest rooms of your childhood, rehearsed for years before he ever walked into your life, and, without either of you fully realizing it, recognize the part he had been unconsciously auditioning to play. Now I want to turn, and this is where I believe the true purpose of this evening lives, to you, not to the narcissist whose fate, as I have said, was never truly in your hands, but to the one who stopped playing along. Because I do not believe the most important transformation in this entire drama belongs to the person left staring into a mirror that no longer flatters him. I believe it belongs to the person who finally stopped being that mirror. Here is what I have come to understand. After decades of sitting with souls in every kind of darkness, the process of becoming whole, what I have called individuation, the lifelong task of becoming, at last, the one true person you were always meant to be, rather than a fragment shaped entirely by others' needs. This process very often does not begin in comfort. It begins in rupture. It begins in exactly the kind of devastating confrontation you may have lived through, or may be living through even now as you sit here tonight. Because to stop playing along with a narcissist's projections, you must do something almost unbearably difficult. You must take back every piece of yourself you had scattered into his reflection. You must retrieve the parts of you that got lost in constant anticipation of his moods. You must reclaim the enormous portion of your own psychic energy that has been spent year after year managing someone else's unmanaged shadow. And when you do this, when you finally withdraw that energy and turn it back toward your own unlived life, you will discover something that may astonish you. You are not simply free of him, you are, for the first time in longer than you can remember, in possession of yourself. I want to speak plainly about the cost of getting here, because I have no patience for inspiration that pretends the road was easy. It was not easy. The person who has spent years, sometimes decades, as another soul's mirror has, in the process, lost track of her own reflection. She has become so skilled at reading the emotional weather of another person that she may have forgotten how to read her own. She may not know, when you ask her plainly what she wants, what she is afraid of, what she truly believes. She may not know the answer because the muscle that produces that answer has gone unused for so long it has nearly atrophied. This is not a flaw in her character. It is the precise and logical consequence of a life spent surviving by anticipating someone else's needs before her own could even fully form. And so the work that follows the rupture, the work of individuation, is not a single dramatic act of walking away. It is a long, patient, often unglamorous excavation. It is learning, sometimes for the first time since childhood, to ask yourself what you feel before you ask what someone else needs from you. It is learning to sit with the discomfort of disappointing someone because you were taught that another's disappointment was a catastrophe you were personally responsible for preventing. It is learning that your own anger, so long suppressed in service of keeping the peace, is not a monstrous thing to be feared, but a signal, an ancient and intelligent messenger telling you precisely where your boundaries have been violated. And here I must say something that I believe with my whole being, something I have watched prove true again and again across every kind of human suffering I have ever studied. What you refused to face in another, you will meet again in yourself until you face it. This is not a threat. It is simply how the psyche works. If you leave this rupture only with a story about the narcissist's villainy and never turn your gaze inward to ask what wound in you made his mirror hunger feel for so long like love, you have not yet completed the work. You have only changed rooms. The same pattern dressed in a different face is patient. It will wait for you. This is why I say the true triumph in this story does not belong to the empath who simply escapes. It belongs to the empath who uses the rupture as the beginning of her own individuation, who looks honestly at the wound that made her available for this arrangement in the first place, and who does the harder, quieter, less dramatic work of healing it, so that the next time a mirror-hungry soul comes looking for a reflecting pool, she recognizes the pattern before she has poured out 10 more years of her life into it. I have watched this transformation happen, and I want to describe it to you because I believe some of you sitting here tonight are already in the middle of it, whether you have named it yet or not. It begins almost always with an exhaustion so total that the old performance simply becomes impossible to sustain. Not a decision, at first, so much as a collapse of the capacity to keep performing. From that exhaustion, if it is met with even a small amount of support, a strange kind of clarity can emerge. The fog of constant anticipation lifts, if only for a moment, and underneath it, something that had been buried for years becomes visible again. A person, not a role, not a function. A person with her own tastes, her own opinions, her own capacity for both anger and joy that she had long ago learned to minimize for the sake of someone else's fragile equilibrium. From there, the individuation deepens in stages I have seen repeat themselves so consistently across so many different lives that I have come to trust them the way one trusts the turning of the seasons. First comes grief, real grief, not for the person who hurt her, but for the years spent orbiting someone else's wound instead of tending her own life. This grief must be honored, not rushed. Too many well-meaning voices try to hurry a wounded soul past this stage, offering premature encouragement, insisting she should already feel liberated, already feel strong. But grief that is not permitted its season does not disappear. It goes underground, the way all unlived experience does, and it waits there to be met another day. Let it come. Let it be as large as it needs to be. Then comes anger, and I want to dwell here for a moment, because so many people, especially those raised to believe their worth lay in their agreeableness, are terrified of their own anger. They have been taught to see it as ugly, as dangerous, as proof that something is wrong with them, rather than proof that something was done to them. But anger, properly metabolized rather than either suppressed or acted out in destruction, is one of the great engines of individuation. It is the psyche's way of saying, this far and no further. It is the force that finally makes a boundary real rather than merely wished for. The empath who learns to feel her own anger without either drowning in it or fleeing from it in shame has recovered an entire dimension of herself that the years of mirroring had required her to surrender. And then at last, if the work is allowed to continue, comes something quieter and more durable than either grief or anger, a settled, unshowy sense of her own worth that no longer depends on being needed by anyone. This is the true end of the story, though it rarely announces itself with fanfare. It looks from the outside almost ordinary. A woman who used to organize her entire day around the emotional temperature of another person now simply lives her own life. She has preferences again. She has boundaries that do not require justification. She can love deeply, genuinely, without dissolving into the person she loves. She has, in the fullest sense of the word, I have spent my life trying to describe, become an individual, not a fragment of someone else's unfinished psychology, but a whole and separate soul, complete in her own right. I want to say one more thing before I close, because I think it is the thing most easily lost in a story that has up to now focused so much on wounds and drama and collapse. The capacity for empathy that made you vulnerable to this pattern in the first place is not a flaw to be surgically removed. It is one of the rarest and most valuable qualities a human being can possess. The task before you is not to become hard, not to become suspicious of every open hand extended towards you, not to armor yourself so completely that you never again risk loving someone who might disappoint you. That would not be healing. That would simply be a different kind of prison, built from fear instead of duty. The task is far more delicate than that. It is to keep the capacity for deep feeling, deep attunement, deep love, and to finally pair it, for the first time in your life, with an equally deep loyalty to yourself. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. But empathy joined with boundaries, that is not a contradiction. That is, I would argue, one of the highest achievements the human psyche is capable of reaching. That is wholeness. That is what the old traditions, in their own language, called wisdom. So let me leave you tonight, not with a warning about the narcissists you may encounter, though heaven knows there is wisdom in recognizing the pattern early. Let me leave you instead with this. The moment you stop playing along is not primarily an act done to someone else. It is an act done for yourself. It is the moment the mirror finally turns around and discovers it was never only a mirror. It was a person the whole time, with her own face, her own voice, her own unrepeatable life, waiting patiently underneath years of borrowed reflections to finally be seen by the one person whose seeing matters most, herself. Whatever becomes of the one who needed you to keep reflecting him, whatever collapse or rage, or, in rarer cases, awakening follows your refusal to keep performing that old role, that story is no longer required to be yours to carry. You did not fail him by refusing to disappear into his need forever. You did not fail the relationship by insisting, at last, on being a whole person within it rather than a function of it. What you did, in the plainest and most important sense, was begin. You began the long, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of becoming the one person you were always capable of becoming, before the world taught you that your worth lay only in your usefulness to someone else's unhealed heart. That work does not end in a single night, and it will not end with the applause of any audience, mine included. It ends, if it ends at all, in the quiet, ordinary moments of a life finally lived from the inside out. A life in which you no longer need anyone's mirror to know that you are real. You already are. You always were. It only took the silence of a mirror who finally stopped lying for you to remember it. Go then and live the rest of this one unrepeatable life as the whole person you were always becoming, not the reflection anyone else required of you, but the self only you were ever meant to carry into the world. And if, in some quiet hour, the old pull returns, the impulse to reach back, to explain yourself one more time, to become useful again in order to feel safe again, pause there, gently, and ask yourself the only question that has ever mattered in this entire story. Am I about to become a mirror again? Or am I finally going to remain a person? Let that question be your compass. It will not fail you. It never failed anyone who was brave enough to keep asking it, again and again, for as long as it took to finally believe the answer.